Let me ask you something. What would you do if you spent your entire life being the best at something, and every single time you got close to proving it, the universe itself reached down and took it away from you? Not your competitors. Not a rulebook. Not politics. The universe. A transmission fails at 406 miles per hour. A rainstorm floods the only place on Earth where you can prove what you built. A sponsor pulls out the week before the biggest run of your life. And then, just when you've pulled the car out of storage after 20 years, just when you finally have the chance to finish what you started, two gunmen are waiting in your driveway in the dark. That is not a racing story. That is something else entirely. But here is what I want you to hold on to before we get into any of it. Mickey Thompson, the man at the center of all of this, never stopped. Every time the universe said no, he came back. Every time the door closed, he found another one. And the engineering he produced along the way, the ideas he had, the problems he solved that nobody else was even asking the right questions about, that work is still alive today. His son took one of his cars to 448 miles per hour in 2018. 30 years after Mickey was gone. You cannot stop a correct idea. You can delay it. You can take the man. But you cannot stop the idea. This is the story of Mickey Thompson. And by the end of this video, I think you're going to understand something about persistence, about engineering, and about what it costs to be right before the world is ready for you. That most people who call themselves motorsport fans have never properly understood. Stay with me, because this one doesn't go where you think it goes. The world Mickey was born into. Picture this. It is 1937. A 9-year-old boy is standing on the Bonneville salt flats in Utah with his father. The air is thin and sharp. The salt stretches out in every direction, flat and white and endless, like the surface of another planet. And out there on that surface, a massive British car, built with 2 aircraft engines, backed by the full industrial power of the English motor industry, is about to attempt a world land speed record. The car fires up. You can feel it before you hear it, and then it moves, and the boy watches it disappear into the distance, faster than anything he has ever seen or imagined. And the record falls, 394 miles per hour, a new mark, a British mark, set by British money, British engineering, British ambition. The boy's name is Marion Lee Thompson, but everyone calls him Mickey, and standing there in the Utah salt, watching that British car do something that no American had ever come close to doing, Mickey Thompson made a promise to himself. Not out loud, not to his father, to himself. One day, he was going to beat that record. And he was going to do it as an American, without an aircraft manufacturer's budget, without a team of university engineers, without anyone's permission. That promise would take him 23 years to act on. And when he finally did act on it, what he built in his garage, not in a factory, not in a sponsored facility, in his actual garage, was so far beyond what anyone expected from a self-taught hot rodder from El Monte, California. Motorsport world genuinely did not know how to process it. But before we get to the car, you need to understand the man, because Mickey Thompson without context is just a series of remarkable numbers. Mickey Thompson with context is something much more interesting. WHO is Mickey Thompson. Mickey Thompson was not an engineer in the formal sense. He did not have a degree. He did not come up through a corporate racing program or a factory development team. He was a pressman at the Los Angeles Times. That was his actual job. He worked the printing presses, and in whatever time was left over, evenings, weekends, every moment he could steal, he built race cars. What he had instead of credentials was something that formal education sometimes produces and sometimes actively works against. He had first principles thinking. He looked at a mechanical problem and did not ask, how do other people solve this? He asked, what is actually happening here, physically, and what would fix it? That approach led him to innovations that changed the sport of drag racing before he ever pointed a car at Bonneville. In 1954, a full 17 years before Don Garlits made it famous, Mickey Thompson built the first Slingshot Dragster. He moved the driver's seat behind the rear axle, not because a rulebook told him to, not because a factory engineer suggested it, because he understood from first principles that putting the driver's weight over the rear wheels at launch would improve traction. Simple physics. Nobody else was doing it. He built twin-engine dragsters when everyone else was working with one engine. He ran a Buick V8, a stock engine, at the Indianapolis 500 in 1962 when every other car in the field used a purpose-built racing power plant. The car ran in the rear, like a modern Formula One car, when the entire field was still front-engined. He was right about that too. Within a few years, the whole field had gone rear-engined. Everywhere Mickey Thompson looked, he saw problems that everyone else had accepted as permanent conditions, and he fixed them, one by one, on a pressman's budget. He was not grumpy like Bill Jenkins was grumpy. Mickey Thompson was something different. He was relentless. He had an energy that people who knew him described as almost unsettling, like he was running on a fuel the rest of the world didn't have access to. He genuinely could not stop, could not rest while there was still a problem unsolved, a record unbroken, a faster way to be found, and the problem he could not let go of. The one that had been living in the back of his mind since he was 9 years old standing on the Bonneville Salt was the land speed record. The British had it. They had built their entire motorsport identity around it, and no American had come close. Mickey Thompson was going to fix that. In his garage, with 4 Pontiac engines. The problem: why 400 mph was impossible? Here is a question most people don't ask about land speed records. What actually makes going faster so hard? The obvious answer is power. You need more power to go faster. And that is true, but it is so incomplete that it barely qualifies as an answer. Because when you actually look at what stops a car from going faster at the absolute limit of what piston engines can do, the answer is not horsepower. It is everything else. Think about what happens to a car moving at 300, 350, 400 miles per hour. The air is not something you push through at that speed. It is a wall. It is a physical force pressing against every surface of the vehicle with an intensity that increases with the square of your velocity. That means that going from 300 to 400 miles per hour does not require a proportional increase in power. It requires a dramatically larger increase because the aerodynamic resistance at 400 mph is significantly more than just a third greater than at 300 mph. So you need to solve the aerodynamics. The car has to be shaped in a way that minimizes the frontal area, keeps airflow attached to the body, and produces as little drag as possible. This is harder than it sounds because you are building this by hand in 1959 without computational fluid dynamics, without wind tunnels you can actually afford, with nothing but your own understanding of physics and your ability to read the air. Then there is the tire problem. At 400 miles per hour, your tires are spinning so fast that the forces trying to tear them apart are almost incomprehensible. Standard racing tires of the era were not designed for these speeds. They would fail. They would come apart. And a tire failure at 400 mph is not a problem you survive. Mickey Thompson had to find someone willing to build tires specifically for this application. Tires that could hold together at speeds no tire had ever been asked to handle. Then there is traction. At the launch and through the run, you need the tires to push the car forward without spinning. On salt, which is not a consistent surface, which varies from day to day and even hour to hour based on temperature and humidity, getting consistent traction is an engineering problem all by itself. And underneath all of this is the engine problem. You need power, enormous amounts of it. But you need it reliably, repeatably, over the length of a full run. An engine that makes 10 horsepower and blows up halfway through the run is worth exactly nothing. The British teams who had held the land speed record for decades solved these problems with enormous budgets, teams of engineers, and the backing of major industrial manufacturers. They had resources that made the problem tractable. Mickey Thompson had none of that. What he had was 4 Pontiac V8 engines he had sourced, a design he had drawn out on the floor of his garage, and an understanding of physics that was ahead of virtually everyone working in the same space. And here is the insight that made the whole thing possible. The insight that was genuinely, fundamentally correct in a way that took the rest of the world years to catch up to. He understood that the way to solve the power delivery problem at 400 miles per hour was not to have one enormous engine. It was to have multiple engines, each driving one wheel independently. Let me explain why that matters. Because it is more elegant than it looks. 4 engines, 4 Pontiac, 415 cubic inch V8s, each engine connected to its own wheel through its own transmission. All 4 transmissions controlled by a single lever operated by the driver. That sounds almost absurdly complicated, and it was complicated. Managing the cables, fuel lines, cooling, ignition, and mechanical connections for 4 separate engines in a car that had to be as light and narrow as possible. That was a problem that Mickey Thompson solved the way he solved every problem, He sat with it until he understood it completely, and then he built what his understanding told him to build. Why 4 engines? Why not one enormous engine? Here is the thinking. One big engine is a single point of failure. One big engine concentrated all of its torque delivery through a single drive system, which created enormous stresses on components that had to stay intact at 400 MPa/CS. One big engine, even if it was powerful enough, had to be physically large, and physically large meant more frontal area, more drag, more of the aerodynamic penalty that was already working against you at those speeds. 4 smaller engines, each driving one wheel, distributed the load. If one engine had a problem, you still had 3. The torque was shared across 4 contact patches instead of 2, which meant each individual component was under less stress. And 4 Pontiac V8s, packaged as tightly as Mickey could manage them, could produce the total horsepower he needed while keeping the car's profile narrower than a single massive power plant would allow. This was not a crazy idea. It was a correct idea. It was ahead of its time, but it was correct. All-wheel drive land-speed cars became the standard approach precisely because the logic Mickey was working with was sound. Now here is where the aerodynamics came in. Mickey had understood since reading everything he could find about high-speed vehicles, that the shape of the car was not secondary to the power, it was equal to it. You could have all the horsepower in the world and lose it to drag if the body wasn't right. The Challenger 1 was built as close to a teardrop as Mickey could manage. Long, narrow, low to the ground, with every surface shaped to let the air slip past rather than pile up against it. He designed it himself. He drew it on his garage floor. And when it was built, it looked like nothing else on the salt. It looked like something from the future. There was no wind tunnel. There was no simulation software. There was Mickey Thompson's understanding of fluid dynamics, his ability to visualize airflow, and his willingness to be wrong and fix it and try again. In 1959, the Challenger 1 made its first full attempt. Mickey ran 363 miles per hour, fast enough to set a class record, but not the 400 he was after, not the record that mattered. He went home. He added superchargers to all 4 engines. He modified the intake system to feed them. He came back in 1960, September 9, 1960. Bonneville Salt Flats. Mickey Thompson climbed into the Challenger 1 and pointed it down the measured mile. The engines fired. All 4 of them, synchronized, producing something close to 30 horsepower through that narrow aluminum body. The car accelerated, and it kept accelerating. And the speed climbed through 350, through 380, through 400, and the instruments read 406.60 miles per hour. 406.60 miles per hour. Mickey Thompson was the fastest man on Earth, the first American past 400. He had beaten John Cobb's one-way record. He had beaten every British car that had ever run on that salt. He had done it in a car he designed on his garage floor and built with his own hands. He brought the car back to the start. He needed to make the return run. The rules require a 2-way average to set an official record. The transmission broke. He got out of the car on the salt flats, 406 miles per hour in one direction, and he could not make the return run. The official record did not stand. Let me sit with that for a moment, because I want you to feel what that means. You have spent years building something. You have solved problems that no one else solved. You have gone faster than any American in history. You have done something genuinely extraordinary, and the record does not count. Now, here is where the NHRA comes into this story. And I want to be precise about this because the relationship between Mickey Thompson and the NHRA is more complicated and more interesting than a simple ban story. The NHRA did not ban Mickey Thompson's car. What happened was more subtle and, in some ways, more frustrating. Mickey Thompson was actually deeply embedded in NHRA drag racing throughout the late 1950s and 1960s. He won at NHRA events. He built the first Slingshot Dragster that debuted at the first ever NHRA US Nationals. He designed innovations that became standard in funny car construction. He was part of the fabric of the organization. But the Challenger 1, the car that went 406 miles per hour, was never an NHRA project. It was a land speed record attempt at Bonneville, which operates under different sanctioning rules entirely. The NHRA's domain is the quarter mile. Bonneville is the FIA's territory, operating under completely different standards. And this is the point that matters. The NHRA, the the organization that Mickey Thompson had helped build, the organization that had benefited from his innovations in dragster design and funny car construction and starting line technology. That organization could not stop Mickey Thompson on the drag strip. He won too much. He built things that were too correct. So the sport absorbed his ideas, gave him some trophies, and moved forward. What the NHRA could not control, what no sanctioning body could control, was what happened on the salt. Out there on the Bonneville flats, Mickey Thompson was operating in a space where his ideas could not be regulated, could not be weight penalized, could not be ruled out of bounds because a manufacturer was upset about the competition. And that is precisely why the Bonneville story matters to the NHRA story, because the same man who was being absorbed and managed by the institutional structure of organized drag racing was also out on the salt demonstrating something that went beyond anything any institution could contain. The man NHRA couldn't stop. And yet, after 1960, Mickey tried twice more to get the official record. In 1962, mechanical problems ended the attempt before it began. The car that had gone 406 miles per hour sat in a garage while Mickey moved on to other things. Indianapolis, 500 entries, drag racing championships, building his tire business, building Score International. He came back in 1968 with a new car, the Challenger 2, even more sophisticated than the first. Twin Ford, 427 engines. A design that Sports Illustrated described as one of the most elegant pieces of engineering they had seen in motorsport, built in 5 months by a team of the best hot rod fabricators in California. The first test runs were extraordinary, speeds approaching 400 miles per hour. The car worked. Mickey Thompson was finally, after 8 years, going to get his record. It rained. An unseasonal storm flooded the Bonneville course and canceled the attempt. Ford pulled their sponsorship. The Challenger 2 went into storage. The years that followed were not quiet for Mickey Thompson. He was never quiet. He built the Mickey Thompson Entertainment Group, which ran stadium off-road racing in arenas across the country. He ran events that drew hundreds of thousands of fans. He was a promoter, an organizer, an entrepreneur. He never stopped moving. But the Challenger 2 was in a warehouse, and the record was unfinished. In January of 1988, Mickey Thompson pulled the Challenger 2 out of storage. He and his son Danny had decided to make one more attempt. 1989 would be the year. They would finally finish what had started on the salt in 1960. By March of 1988, the car was being prepared. The plans were made. The run was coming. On March 16, 1988, Mickey Thompson and his wife Trudy were preparing to leave their home in Bradbury, California. 2 gunmen, employed by a former business partner named Michael Goodwin, a man who had gone into business with Mickey and whose relationship had ended with a court awarding a 700-0 judgment in Mickey's favor, emerged from near the front gate. Mickey Thompson and his wife were murdered in their driveway. The case went unsolved for 19 years. Michael Goodwin was finally convicted in 2007. Mickey Thompson was 59 years old. He had been, in the words of the NHRA Hall of Fame that eventually inducted him, the quintessential California hot rodder. A man who had set more speed and endurance records than any other person in automotive history. A man who had innovated across every discipline of the sport he loved. He never got his official record. The Challenger 2 went back into storage. Danny Thompson, grieving and lost, put the car away and walked away from Bonneville. He wouldn't see it again for nearly 15 years. Here is what I keep coming back to when I think about this story, and I want to say it carefully because I think it is easy to miss in the grief of how it ended. Mickey Thompson was not defeated, delayed, frustrated, ultimately taken far too soon, but not defeated, because what he had built, the ideas, the engineering, the mechanical reality of what a purpose-built land speed record car could be, that did not go into storage when the Challenger 2 did. Danny Thompson carried it. For 30 years, he carried it. He retired from racing in 1995. He moved to Colorado. He built a life. But the Challenger 2 was always there, the unfinished thing, the promise his father had made to himself as a 9-year-old boy on the salt. In 2003, Danny was invited back to Bonneville to drive a small restored streamliner. He climbed in. He made a run. And the salt called him back. He began, slowly, the work of restoring the Challenger 2. Not a quick job, an exhaustive, meticulous restoration of a 1968 car that had been in storage for decades, updated with modern engines that Mickey never got to use. 2. Brad Anderson, 500 cubic inch Hemi V8s, each producing 2 500 horsepower. 5,000 horsepower total, running on 87% nitromethane. In 2016, Danny Thompson ran the Challenger 2 at Bonneville and set a class record. The car his father had built in 1968 was still competitive. The ideas were still correct. In 2018, 50 years after the Challenger 2 first came to Bonneville, 30 years after Mickey was murdered, Danny Thompson made his final run, 448.757 miles per hour, the official record, the piston-powered land speed record for naturally aspirated vehicles. The thing Mickey Thompson had been chasing since he watched John Cobb go 394 miles per hour as a 9-year-old boy. Done. Finished. Correct. The man was gone. The idea was not. What this actually means. I want to talk about something for a moment that I think gets lost in the drama of this story, because the murder and the tragedy are real and they matter, but they are not the point. The point is something harder to name. Mickey Thompson was right about the 4-engine all-wheel drive approach, about aerodynamics as the limiting factor at high speed, about the Slingshot Dragster configuration, about rear-engined Indy cars, about tube frame construction in drag racing, about almost everything he turned his attention to. He was right before the institutions were ready to accept it. He was right before the rulebooks reflected it. He was right before the money followed it. And every single time, the machinery of organized motorsport found a way to absorb his correctness without fully crediting it. The Slingshot Dragster became universal. His name on it was a footnote. The Indy 500 went rear-engined. His 1962 entries were a curiosity in the history books. The tube frame construction he pioneered showed up in NHRA Pro stock after the Vega was banned. We talked about that in the Bill Jenkins video, and the same pattern repeated itself. The idea wins. The man who had it first gets a plaque and an induction ceremony and a paragraph in a Wikipedia article. But here is the thing about Mickey Thompson that separates him from almost everyone else in this story. He did not stop to wait for credit. He was already working on the next thing. The NHRA could absorb his drag racing innovations, and he was already on the salt. Ford could pull his sponsorship, and he was already building Score International. The record could stay unofficial, and he was already planning the next attempt. The only thing that stopped Mickey Thompson was something no engineering solution could address, and even that did not stop the idea. Danny finished it. 30 years later. 50 years after the car was built. The record stands today. That is what correct looks like when it refuses to quit. Here is the question I want to leave you with, and I genuinely want to hear what you think in the comments. Mickey Thompson spent his life being right before the world was ready. He built things that worked before the institutions knew how to classify them. He won races, set records that weren't officially recognized, and innovated in ways that changed the sport without always getting credit for it. The NHRA Hall of Fame eventually put his name on a wall. His tire company still exists. His son completed his life's work. Is that enough? Is posthumous, delayed institutional recognition the right ending for a life like that? Or is there something broken in how motorsport, and maybe how we in general, treats people who are correct before we are ready to admit it? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and this is one I genuinely want to think through with you. If this kind of real history, the story behind the official story, the engineering that actually explains the outcomes, is what you come here for, subscribe. Every video on this channel is built this way. We do not do surface level. We go all the way down. And next time, we are going to look at a story that connects directly to everything we have covered in this series. A team that took the lessons of Bill Jenkins and Mickey Thompson and built something so effective that it did not just get penalized or banned. It made the entire class rethink what a competitive car was supposed to look like. Same sport, different era. Same pattern. I think you are going to find it very familiar. See you there.